Okay, perfect. So, a lot of what I'm going to carry across to you today is going to sound quite simple, and I think that's ultimately the goal. We shouldn't tend to overcomplicate these things. But I'm going to take you through the why, the how, the what, the when, along those lines, so we can get a good understanding of our approach. You will find quite a bit of my content is more pitched towards, I would say, postgraduate researchers, but the tips and guidance could transfer to staff as well. And I think also particularly for staff, your supervisors, this is maybe something that you can carry over to your students. So why? I've added a little image of a compass there because I think if we have our why, in the changing landscape of technology and AI and new developments, what grounds us, what starts off as our compass is the thing that guides our approach to how we do something. And if we've got that down, it doesn't really matter what new thing is developed, if we're doing it with integrity. So if we look at the foundation of academic integrity, we turn to our Singapore statement. This was a big global conference where a whole lot of very clever people from different backgrounds got together and they decided what are the core kind of foundations of the things that should guide research integrity. So honesty in all aspects of your research, accountability in the conduct of research, professional courtesy and fairness in working with others. And I think this extends to concepts like whether you're pulling through bias in the way that you go about your research, good stewardship on research on behalf of others. When we approach academic writing integrity in the context of AI, we look at the human-centeredness. You, as the researcher, are at the center of the research process. You cannot remove yourself from that process. And when we look at the policy and what it says, you'll start to see this more clearly as well. So also part of academic integrity is that research is not just about the output alone. So yes, we're obviously working towards an end product, but it's also about the process. When we write, we're obviously documenting the process of how we went about that research. And therefore, from the process in terms of collecting the data and information all the way through to writing it up, we have to do that with integrity. So when we're writing, we also have an authorship contract with readers. And what this contract says is that the work that we've written and produced, we are putting our name to this document. We are saying that it's factually correct. It's our own original ideas unless we have cited or quoted otherwise, and it's not likely to cause harm. So readers will believe you are the author unless you say otherwise. And this includes words, images, charts, graphs, data, ideas, arguments, methods. We should know this. This is kind of basic. But particularly for your younger students, if you're a supervisor or if you're studying yourself, one of the mistakes that I made in my honors year was I did this beautiful visual kind of flow chart. It was a representation of the literature and how it's changed over time. And I've taken it and I've plopped it into my research project. And the examiners came back and they said, but who created this flow chart? Whose work is it? And we also have to remember to cite ourselves when we generate something. So let's move on to the what. What are the policies and the things that guide our approach? So you might already be aware, but for quite a long time now, our institution has had a policy on plagiarism in support of academic writing integrity, which is currently under review. I'm not sure if the new version has been published yet. I don't think so, but it is being re-looked at. And the policy basically says plagiarism is the representation of works, so this is words, ideas, or creations of other people as the writer's own. And that also includes a kind of definition of self-plagiarism. So this is when you've used work that's previously been presented or published, or if you're students, if your work has previously been examined, and you're now copy-pasting it into your text without acknowledging it. You would need to cite this, you would need to completely re-paraphrase this work into your own words, and you would need to acknowledge that it has previously been published or examined. So the good news is that plagiarism issues can be solved by using ethical principles and practices, critically engaging with sources, explaining your ideas in relation to others' ideas, and using correct citation and paraphrasing. So turning to the university's position statements and plagiarism, and I must just put this up front, and what we've kind of started to see through our discussions with departments and different faculties is that not everyone is applying the AI position statements in the same way, because the policy does allow faculties to determine acceptable AI use and also add in additional guardrails, is what the policy calls it. So there are some departments at SU who do not allow any use of AI. You cannot use Grammarly, you cannot use ChatGPT, you cannot use anything in terms of the research and writing process. So if you are a student, I would just check with your departments and also your supervisor first before using any AI tools to see what your supervisor and department determines as acceptable use. So the reason why we can't have AI write large portions of our text, do our full literature reviews, synthesize all our data, analyze our results, is because it cannot act as an author. It doesn't have unique ideas of its own. It typically uses existing data sets to generate the information. And then also when you produce something, there is this idea that you have verified the information and you have gone and cited original research and authors. So parameters. AI content may not form a substantial part of any assessment unless it's been allowed. I think that's quite an important parameter if you are a student. When you think about approaching something, when you start to sit and you work through the process, is how I'm using AI done in an ethical way? Is my work still my own? I also want to just go on to this section, and this is what's going to kind of form the basis of what I would say is acceptable AI use. And I'm going to give you some practical tips here, but there's other things I want to get to first before we get to that. So AI, according to our position statements, can be used as long as they're not used to generate a substantial part of the relevant work, but it can be used to improve text that is already written. So what that means is if you're writing text and you're using AI as an academic editor, that could be acceptable usage, and we'll get to that. But in the context of the policies and the position statements, what does it mean for researchers? So you're not going to be using AI to draft all of your writing, right? Because part of the drafting, the going through the kind of the motions of working out what you want to say, you're looking at your results, you're going through the literature, and you're intimately involved in that process, so you cannot separate yourself from that process. There are some departments that might allow more of the idea generation, so using AI kind of as like a critical reader or second voice that you're springboarding ideas off of. But there's other departments who say, no, that critical process of working through something, thinking about something, is the researcher's process. So you kind of have to determine that with your department or your discipline, what would be acceptable. I would not rely on AI to generate references. I think if you're using more trusted reference management systems, like EndNote, for example, which the university has a license for, and the library does really good training on, I would maybe stick more to that than I would upload a reference list to, let's say, ChatGPT and ask it to fix it because of its ability to bring in bias and kind of hallucinated information. I would also not allow AI to conduct my entire literature review and write that for me. I would also say you're not going to be uploading your interview transcripts, your lab results, or any proprietary information into an AI tool and ask it to produce your analysis. The reason being is because that's part of the research process. You are meant to be taking those transcripts or taking those results and sitting with it, looking at it, and giving your interpretation of the information and data. And this is quite obvious, and it's kind of alluded to in what I've just said, but any confidential, sensitive, or unpublished copyrighted information should not be uploaded. You might find, for example, students in biomedical sciences or engineering, they could potentially have patents coming out of their work. And I would caution those students using any form of AI to kind of copy edit their work as well, because there's no kind of guarantee of where that information is going. There is kind of talk that something like Copilot has good GDPR kind of regulations and guidelines behind it. So it is kind of more recommended for students or staff to use. But there are still some issues and things you need to consider before giving it access to information. If you are a postgraduate student, just a note, AI declaration form is a compulsory process. It's typically a conversation that you have with your supervisor, and you tick off aspects in the form of how you've used it or planning to use AI. And then your supervisor guides you on acceptable usage. There is also another form that you fill in that accompanies the examination process. And essentially what this process is you're acknowledging how you've used it, but you're also providing a justification that the work is still your original work, that AI hasn't completely overtaken the process for you. And then very basically, the technical elements. If you're new to Stellenbosch University, you've never studied at the university, or maybe you're a new researcher, we do have an amazing library guide that the library has, and it provides various ways of how to reference different things and also the different methods as well. And then the kind of like golden rule is once you stick to a certain style of referencing, you keep it throughout your writing. So let's get onto the how. And this is developing your knowledge claim, but first identifying knowledge claims in academic writing. And I think if you've got some kind of core basics down, you might not even need AI to be writing for you. So just to acknowledge Professor Chrissy Bowie, I'm drawing on her work here in terms of her development and conceptualization of the knowledge claim, because I think it's very important and helpful as kind of a writing guide and tool. So often we think that referencing and citations is just about avoiding plagiarism. But I want to take you a little bit deeper than that as a concept, that referencing is also about acknowledging the broader scholarly debate or conversation in the field. Who you reference and how you reference is important. And it's not just to acknowledge other work, but it's to pull in arguments that support your claims, don't support your claims, in order to critically engage with the field. So in academic writing, you might already know this, but we use the assert. So we make a claim, we assert something, and then we support it. And this is known as the knowledge claim and then the evidence structure. As we know in academic writing, we need to weigh and evaluate evidence We're using sources that support our argument, but we're also using sources that don't support our argument, and we provide counter arguments or evidence that challenges it. And essentially what this means is it's a conversation. So how do we make a knowledge claim? I'm going to give you some visual representations as well, just so you can see it visually within the text. So a knowledge claim is what you, as the author, believe to be true. So when you're reading through literature by other authors, you're pulling out claims that resonate with you and your argument. So you're first saying, what am I trying to say within my broader piece? And you're pulling out smaller knowledge claims from different texts, different peer-reviewed work or results that have been conducted from experiments, for example, and you're saying, okay, what resonates with me? What do I believe to be true? You then identify, right, this, and then you support these claims by citing from the evidence. So essentially what you're doing is taking these smaller knowledge claims and you're weaving them together to support your overall argument and claim. So here I've pulled an example from one of the academics at our university. They co-authored this paper. And it kind of looks at the African government's response and how they use more Western COVID in order to combat COVID-19, how they were adopting more Western approaches in managing and dealing with the pandemic. And they're counter-arguing that actually, when you're using more African traditional knowledge systems approaches in handling and dealing with the pandemic, it's more successful because it translates better into our unique African context. So it's a wall of text. It can be a little bit intimidating, especially if you're like myself, who's from a humanities background, in terms of a lot of the data coming through here. But if you break down that text, you will see that the authors have made an assert or claim within the text. And then they've weaved through other knowledge claims to support their overall kind of argument for that specific paragraph. And then they've supported it with evidence. Students can get sometimes a little bit confused. They think that this is the formula of academic writing, that you kind of have to follow it just like this. But remember, as we know, claims can come at the end, claims can come in the middle. It's more your style of writing and what works for that particular paragraph, and then supporting it. The evidence is the actual citation. So they've taken claims, they've paraphrased it into their own words, and they've cited it. And they've weaved these claims together in order to form a kind of ultimate knowledge claim that they're trying to make. And when you form these knowledge claims together in many different paragraphs, you're weaving the golden thread throughout. So moving on to paraphrasing, I'm yet to find the best kind of resource on paraphrasing that goes beyond it being as simple as this. I think it's something we still struggle with, particularly if you're not writing in your mother tongue. But ultimately, if you ask a lot of people, this is still the kind of old school way of approaching it. And it's basically reading the text, identifying the knowledge claim. So you're getting out your highlighter and you're identifying the different claims. You're then going to decide for yourself, what claims am I wanting to make? You're putting that into your own words, paraphrasing it, rewriting the text. Sometimes that could be a conversation. Maybe you want to say it out loud. That might be easier for you to write it. You're citing where that information came from because it's not your own original idea. And then you're going to compare it to that original text. Sometimes what also works for paraphrasing is changing it from active to passive voice or vice versa. And then you only use quotation marks if it's a direct quotation from the text. So when to quote, let's say you would lose the original kind of core idea, especially if it's a specialized concept or definition. And then also if you're interrogating the exact wording itself. So let's move on to the when. Can AI tools support academic writing? What could this potentially look like? So in order to kind of move further into this kind of concept and idea, and there's many different approaches, I must just say there's a lot of information out there, but this was kind of my concept of what I think could be a sound way of approaching it. For many years, universities have utilized academic editors. But the reality of an academic editor, they are worth their weight in gold and they're very important, but can be very expensive. And I think this could be, a bit of a barrier for some students who are just trying to pay their fees. But AI has provided an opportunity to kind of level the playing field. And I do see that as a positive, as long as it's used in an ethical way. So let's kind of interrogate the concept of what an academic editor does. So their role is to improve the clarity, punctuation, grammar, and spelling of a piece of writing. They do not rewrite the content, but they may provide suggestions. And kind of what this looks like is an editor can change your sentence construction and word choice as long as it doesn't change the content and the original meaning of something. They can solve problems like consistency, but they also need to make comments of, consistent inconsistency, so the reader is aware and it's something that they can improve upon themselves. The editor should not change the structure, but they can make comments on improvements. And then the editor should comment on content, logical and conceptual problems, but they can't change this for the writer. If you think about the role of an editor, yes, they're fixing your punctuation, grammar, and spelling, but they're also acting as a critical reader of what you've written. They're never going to rewrite sections completely for you, besides those key things that they can do. But they can provide comments. And I think this is good for us as writers because getting feedback on our writing ultimately helps us improve it. So, AI acting as an academic editor, what could this look like? So, AI can obviously improve the quality and provide critical feedback, but it needs to operate as an academic editor within that domain. So if you are particularly using, for example, large language models, they have the ability to generate text for you. It's important to prompt the AI appropriately. But in order to start that process, you need to understand the capabilities, but also the limitations of that particular AI. So I would recommend, and I haven't given any specific tool for you to use because I think there's lots out there. But what I will say is first check its capabilities. Is the tool that I've selected intended to do the thing that I want it to do? And then also look at its limitations. What are the typical biases and things that this tool is pulling through? Also, particularly in academic writing, there's very much an AI writing voice. Us as writers, our unique kind of flavor in the way that we write is important. It's something that needs to be maintained because I also think it fits into the whole concept of the idea of what original contribution is. And if we go back to our original section, you as the researcher should not be separated from that process. So I want to encourage you to maintain kind of your unique flavor in the way that you write. And also look into kind of the selected tools, common phrases, wording or sentence structure it tends to reproduce, and ask it not to do that, not to pull that into your writing. And we will get there. So just as a general kind of concept of things to keep in the back of your mind when you are using AI in academic writing, and I've pulled these questions from Professor Willem Veree because I think he framed it really nicely. So ask yourself, are you using AI in a way that promotes your own well-being and the well-being of others? Are you strengthening your agency as a researcher when using AI? And are you willing and able to be held accountable for how you use AI in your research? Very important concepts. So I like to call this section Becoming an AI Wrangler. And I've added a picture of a cowgirl. Insert your face there, cowboy, cow person. And I wanted to kind of interrogate what could be a good prompt to ask. And sometimes we need to wrangle the AI back into what we want because it goes off in its own tangent and takes us away from its original purpose. So when you're formulating your prompt, you need to be quite specific on the role you want it to play because that frames it. It's kind of the lens in which it approaches your work. Um, Clearly indicate the format in which you want it to present. Put specific phrases. So this is your discipline-specific terminology. You do not want it to change. Provide examples of the type of output you'd like. So if you actually give it examples, it learns from those examples. Guide and constrain the AI. So you not only tell it what you want it to do, you tell it what you don't want it to do. And then obviously be prepared to follow up with prompts. If I had to give kind of an approach to this process, my general sense is don't upload a whole document and ask it to correct it. I would definitely work in sections and I would take my text, put it into the AI, but I would make my changes in the original document. I wouldn't do a copy paste process over it. I think that maintains a level of critical engagement with the text because you are seeing the types of feedback it's given to you, and then you going into your original document and making those changes. So I've worked on a prompt example, and this is something I've been thinking about. In terms of our previous guidelines as an academic editor, what could this role of an AI play in correcting a text? As you can see, I've said you may, and I've also said you may not, based on what a role of a typical academic editor would play. But let's see if it's done what I wanted it to do. So back in 2023, when I graduated with my master's, we didn't have AI in terms of large language models yet, or at least they weren't widely used. Yes, we did have things like Grammarly or spell check and a whole lot of other systems, but that concept of something writing for you did not exist in the accessible way that it does now. So what I did is I took an extract from my thesis that is published on SunScholar, and I decided to take that previous prompt that we just looked at, and I applied it to the section of the text. I would like to say what I'm doing is I will provide a handout of my slides. I have sent it through, so hopefully Krishna will very kindly send it through to you so you can kind of interrogate this as a concept for yourself a little bit more. I think it's kept a lot of the flavor of how I've written it originally, which I really like. I think that's a positive thing. The only section it's kind of changed is more of like a grammar related thing. And if you can see, it might be a little bit small for you, but it's put it in bold for that section. And if I had to compare the original to how the AI academic edited or did copy editing for me, I would say I think it's done it quite nicely. You might then ask the question, well, Cristan, should we not just use like a Grammarly, for example? Yes, you could, but Grammarly, from the best of my knowledge, or other systems related to that, might not give you the broader kind of structural thing that an academic editor does in terms of providing, coherence throughout a piece. Potentially it might, but I haven't used Grammarly as much in terms of my own writing. So it is something you need to think about. Choose the tool that works for you. Check its, where it houses its server, where your information that you're inputting into this thing is going to end up. So you're in line with university policy, but also to protect yourself as the researcher. So further to whether the prompt worked, underneath that section it gave me editorial comments and suggestions. And to be quite fair, I don't know if I found this section as helpful because a lot of it was picking up on was specific terminology or phrasing that I would use throughout my thesis that is discipline specific. So I would say when prompting, I think maybe add quotation marks to the terminology you want to ensure that the AI does not change, because it might provide similar meanings or as synonyms to something, and it changes the original content and meaning of what you're trying to say. But the fact that it didn't do this to my work based on the prompt that I submitted, it means that it is doing a good job in terms of providing a role as an academic editor. You could potentially develop a phrase book that you keep of your discipline-specific terms, just to ensure that the AI isn't changing this. Ultimately, you can also just self-edit your academic writing. Go about it in the old school way. Nothing wrong with that. Works really well. You can reread your writing back aloud to yourself. Is it flowing? Well, maybe you want to get, a colleague or a friend to read your writing. That also works great. Often we like to edit too soon in the writing process, and I think that's part of the problem what runs us into writer's block. We're editing way too soon, and we're trying to get all the finer details down first instead of flowing with the writing, and then coming back to the academic editing part at the end. And then keeping a reading journal is really important, whether this is digitally handwritten, using EndNote, whatever it is. You need to have a place where you've made comments on particular pieces of data or literature, and the exact source of where that information came from. I think particularly with students, when things go missing is when we start to thumbsuck our references and draw on information that just isn't accurate. And that is the end of my presentation. I don't know, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I like to not speak too long because it can be information overload, but I also just want to encourage you to go look at more resources. Maybe my approach is not the best approach, but I think it's a good kind of starting point or idea concept to work with.
Thank you very much, Cristan. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourselves or pose the question in the chat. Yes, Reverend Addo. Oh, you're muted?
You're muted, Reverend.
We cannot hear you, Reverend.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, I'm so grateful for the approach that you use in order to be able to help us. I'm thinking that we can have access to the recording so that we can listen to it again. But there was some mystical fear that is associated with going into the realms of AI. And I think you have succeeded in helping us to be able to take that fear away. And I'm happy with the approach there. But I want to find out, how do you use the approach of the AI in terms of your research area in order for it to be able, there are times that you have ideas and how to come out with how to decipher the idea and to implement it in the process of the research becomes a problem. And the AI has a nice way of trying to help you package. How do you partner effectively so that you can guard against the ethical aspects where your work will not become more or less like you have used the tools of AI to sit in the office or in the church to do your work for you? How do you use it effectively so that it can enhance your creativity and help you out? Thank you.
It's such a good question. And I think I see, Reverend, you're currently doing your master's. If we go back to that original declaration that you would need to fill in as a master's student, you see the different kind of concepts, different approaches of how you could be using AI, and you can tick those boxes accordingly, but you would still need to justify how the work is your own. So I 100% agree with you. AI, in terms of the writing process, can kind of synthesize things very nicely for us. And it's very tempting to pull in all our information and say synthesize or do this or do that. But the reality is it borderlines on an unethical way of approaching academic writing, because part of the research process is your ability to bring things together. So what I would do in terms of your prompt then is maybe ask it, where have I not synthesized information clearly? Please make a comment. And then go back to those sections and interrogate it further. And then you, as the researcher and writer, go in and correct those sections. I think that would be more of an ethical way to approach it than getting it to synthesize all this information for you.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm grateful.
All right. And then there, I think, were one or two questions in the chats that came through, whether there are any AI editors that are forbidden. As far as I understand, I don't think any tools are forbidden. It's just how you use them that's restricted.
By the US, there might be some Chinese AI software that they wouldn't want people using based on political bias. But from my knowledge, I'm not sure either. We'd have to interrogate that one further. What AI tools are allowed to be used when writing research? I don't think there is a finite list. The library does have some options available for you on their AI hub that you can take a look at. But before using any AI tools, I would first interrogate, where does my information go if I upload it to the system? What biases and contradictions does the system kind of produce when it's giving feedback on my writing? And then I'd also run it by your supervisor, whether they are happy with you using this particular system. And I think that answers all the questions then.
Yes, and I also shared our library guide for AI. There are some useful tools,
very useful, yeah.
Always with the caveat, make sure how it is acceptable in your specific environment.
Perfect. Okay, right, I'm not seeing any more hands then.
There's one, Dr. Pulyun.
Hi, I would just like to know, so if you have used AI in the way that you suggested by using that prompt, do you need to reference or include that in a way where, yeah, not that you reference that, because I mean, you still did all the writing, but how do you acknowledge how you used it in the way that you used it, if my question makes sense?
I think the acknowledgement wouldn't necessarily come in your text per se. It would come in, for example, your submission to a journal, whether your journal wants you to declare something or to tick a box. The declaration would, from a postgraduate perspective, would come on that declaration form that the faculty has available. So you would then say, I've used it as, an academic editor, or to check grammar, punctuation, spelling, those types of things. And I think that is quite a safe space to be in, because that's what an academic editor would do anyway. And based on the policy, if it's checking grammar, spelling, punctuation, theoretically you don't have to declare it. But I do know on our declaration form for AI at the institution, there is a box for you to tick on that. So I don't think it needs to be acknowledged in the text per se, but I'd also look at whether your journal, if you're doing published work, requires certain declarations, and just kind of follow those guidelines.
Perfect, thank you.
Any final questions for Cristan?
Yes, one more just from me.
Go ahead, Ms. Sekwete. I
Thank
got
you
your
so
surname
much
correct.
no, but it's fine. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm just curious to know, does the university have any AI tracking software? Because I know, software like Turnitin and so forth is used for students when they load up their essays and so forth. So does the university have any AI tracking software as such?
So the kind of position on AI detection software for our Turnitin, I'm not sure if this has changed, but I think as it stands now, it has been turned off. And I think the university has recognized that it's not, and across the board, many institutions who use Turnitin as a similarity detection software, that the AI feature is not accurate. Because it's often picking up people who are writing in a second language to their mother tongue, which sometimes translates very similar to how an AI would write. So it's been turned off at the institution. But if you are curious or not too sure, you can also check with your department if they apply any other parameters to your checking of those things, but I don't think so. But I will say that when we have issues of people running into ethical issues at the institution, where things have gone off for examination or about to go off, or during the process, supervisors are concerned, it's very easy for examiners and supervisors to pick up when something has been AI written. And I think it's because of the falsification and hallucination of things that creep into the written work. They can also see that it's not their students' own, because they get to understand how that student writes and thinks, and sometimes it's just not correlating well. So I'll give you an example. Something went off for examination. I don't think it was at our institution, it was at another institution. And the examiner started reading through this research, and they went and looked and interrogated a particular reference, and they looked at the date. And they could see that it was almost impossible for that person to have published that on that specific date because they had passed away. And we sometimes forget our academics are going off to conferences. They're very familiar with the colleagues that are in their field, and they have the insider information to be able to pick those things up. So I think as a kind of integrity process, when we look at research, that's also important to take into account.